Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're opening up an archive that, frankly, it defies modern comprehension. We have a whole stack of medical affidavits, police reports, and historical records that all point to an event that the authorities themselves, even as they were closing the case, just called impossible.
And that's really the core of what we're tackling here. Our mission isn't just to tell a story. It's to solve a mystery, one that stretches across 157 years. We're going to follow the facts to explain the vanishing of a man named Charles Dexter Ward in 1928.
A disappearance that just violates every known law of physics, of security.
Right. And it forces us, and it forced them, to consider this unspeakable alternative that the Providence police tried so desperately to bury.
So let's start right there, at that impossible endpoint. April 14, 1928, it's a Sunday morning. We have the hospital logs, the initial police reports, all documenting the disappearance of Charles Dexter Ward. He's 26 years old.
And he's not just anyone. He's the only son of, one of Providence's wealthiest, most respected families. So the public profile here is huge, which, combined with the facts, made this an instant sensational headline.
And those facts, that's what makes this whole thing so compelling, isn't it? The attendant, he comes in for the morning rounds at 7 a.m., finds the third floor room 3A, completely empty.
And we really have to stress for you, the listener, the absolute ironclad security protocols they had in place. This was a private hospital for mentally disturbed patients. The procedures were completely airtight.
Absolutely. Dr. Waite, the head of the hospital, he confirmed that the room was locked from the inside when the attendant did his rounds at 1 a.m., and it was still locked from the inside when they came back in the morning.
So if the patient had somehow gotten out, the key would have to be with him, but the room was still sealed.
Exactly. And the physical constraints, this is what immediately frustrated the police. There was a single tall window in the room, but it was barred with heavy wrought iron.
And Detective Rourke, in his initial report, he confirms the bars were undisturbed. No signs of tampering, no forced entry, nothing. So how does a man, diagnosed with profound psychological distress, a man under orders for sedatives, literally just dematerialize from a bolted room on the third floor?
I have to ask, though, did they really just accept the word impossible? Didn't they look for a secret passage or maybe a confederate with a master key?
Oh, they investigated every single terrestrial possibility you can imagine. The preliminary report details it all. But every path led back to the same conclusion: an empty room sealed from within. Dr. Waite's quote to the press, he said this was, frankly, an impossible situation. That wasn't an exaggeration. It was a statement of fact based on the physical evidence.
But the impossible always leaves some kind of signature, doesn't it?
It does. And in this case, it was a sensory clue. An odor.
Right. The initial newspaper reports mentioned this. The staff detected a faint, unfamiliar, and deeply unpleasant chemical odor just lingering in the corridor right near Ward's room during the night.
A chemical odor. That's the first real hint that this wasn't some kind of, spiritual event. This was maybe a calculated alchemical act.
Yeah, exactly. And the hospital log. When we look at that, it shows this whole thing had been building for weeks. Let's turn to the entry for Ward, dated March 29, 1928. This is just 2 weeks before he vanishes.
And it paints a picture of intense agitation. It suggests this vanishing wasn't spontaneous at all. It was calculated. It was ritualistic.
At 10 p.m. that night, the attendant, a man named H. Larrabee, he recorded that patient Ward refused his nightly sedatives.
And the reason he gave is just chillingly specific. He said he needed his wits for the approaching conjunction.
That one phrase, approaching conjunction, it just shifts the whole context, doesn't it? This isn't just a patient refusing meds. This is someone preparing for something, following a celestial timeline.
He was watching the sky. He was waiting for a precise moment when his great work, or maybe someone else's arrival, was set to happen.
And that preparation, it gets violent. At 1:15 a.m., the log notes, loud, resonant, non-English chanting. It was so distressing that it upset the other patients.
We have a specific quote from a Mr. Abernathy in the next room, 3C. He claimed the sounds were physically changing the environment. He said the chanting was making the air cold.
Making the air cold. That's a profound detail. It suggests something beyond just sound, a sensory effect that's hard to dismiss as just, a psychological delusion.
Right. So when the attendant, Larrabee, goes in to quiet Ward down, he finds him standing by the barred window, just looking up at the night sky. He wasn't responding to him at all.
He was talking to the night, and he utters this very specific warning. He is coming, and the fool will it cannot stop him.
And that's the pivot. He names his adversary, Dr. Willett. We know he's the family physician, the man who had him committed. This confirms that Willett is somehow central to whatever Ward is doing. He knows his enemy is trying to interfere.
And then at 2 a.m., that signature smell comes back. Larrabee described it as sharp, like burned salts, but also musty, like a tomb.
The smell of the dead and the smell of high-temperature chemistry together. And after that, Ward just falls silent. He sits on his cot, smiling.
So the final image is a man who has either achieved his goal or, maybe even more terrifying, has just finished setting the stage for someone else's arrival.
Exactly. The vanishing, the teleportation, it was all preceded by this ritualistic countdown. The cryptic warnings, the occult chanting, and that unmistakable odor of necromantic salts.
What's so fascinating here is that the disappearance in 1928 is really just the final act of a story that began a decade earlier. To understand the vanishing, we have to go backward.
Precisely. And for that, we follow Dr. Marinus Willett's meticulous medical case history. This document is our main source for understanding Charles Dexter Ward, for mapping his psychological descent, which really began all the way back in 1918.
Willett's early assessment confirms that Ward was, fundamentally a brilliant and stable young man. He was really dedicated to antiquarian and genealogical studies. He was just looking for his family history.
And what he found was the seed of his own destruction. The catalyst for everything happens in the spring of 1918.
That's when Ward, tracing his maternal lineage, he uncovers the name of an ancestor. Joseph Curwen.
A name that was basically history's ultimate black sheep, a figure who had been successfully, deliberately suppressed from Providence history for over 150 years.
Yeah, Willett notes Curwen was a highly controversial 18th century figure. He showed up in Providence in 1692, right after fleeing the Salem witch trials.
And he quickly got a reputation. An eccentric merchant, accused by locals of being an alchemist, a practicing sorcerer. He was the subject of all this dark, widespread folklore. The town was so terrified of him that he was, eradicated in an extra-legal raid on his farm in 1771.
But for Charles, this scholarly interest, it quickly became something else, something pathological. Willett classified it as a profound pathological fixation, monomania.
An obsession so consuming, it just pushes aside everything else. This wasn't research anymore, it was identity erosion. Ward started taking these extreme research trips, haunting colonial archives in Salem, New York, specifically looking for obscure occult holdings.
He wasn't looking for historical context, he was looking for a how-to guide, wasn't he?
He was. He wanted to replicate what his ancestor did. And the obsession found a physical form around 1920 when Ward found an unfinished portrait of Curwen.
And Willett's notes here are so specific. He describes the physical resemblance between Charles and his 18th century ancestor as astonishing and deeply unsettling.
And you can imagine, for Charles, this visual confirmation just shattered the barrier between past and present. It convinced him he wasn't just related to Curwen, he was, in some way, his living heir, tasked with finishing his ancestor's work. That portrait became a psychological anchor for the whole obsession.
An obsession that became fatal when he found the actual instruction manual. Right inside the walls of the old Ward family property on Olney Court, he finds a hidden cache of Curwen's personal effects.
And that cache was lethal. It had Curwen's 17th century journal, correspondence detailing these dark transactions, and crucially, all these formulae written in an impenetrable cipher.
And from that moment on, his studies became intensely practical. He dropped out of graduate school entirely to decipher these texts. He tried to pass them off to his family as advanced principles of chemistry and physics.
He was lying to them, maybe even lying to himself to protect the truth, which was that he was now practicing necromancy.
You see the shift reflected in what he was buying, too. His academic interests just warped toward practical occultism. He started acquiring these extremely obscure texts, works by Borellus, Paracelsus, Hermes Trismegistus.
All sources focused on the transformative nature of matter and spirit. And at the same time, he started purchasing these esoteric chemicals on a massive scale.
This internal change, it produced some undeniable physical signs. He started wasting away. He grew thin, developed this persistent hacking cough, and became strictly nocturnal, secretive, locking his parents out of his study.
His body was being stressed, depleted by the unholy nature of the work he was undertaking.
But the most unnerving sign of his psychological erosion was the change in how he communicated. Willett noted that Charles started using archaic phraseology. He was suddenly talking like a man from the 1700s.
And even more telling, his handwriting began to slope, to slowly morph into a near-perfect mimicry of Curwen's 18th century hand. It's like the man's identity was actively being overwritten by this persona he'd resurrected from history.
The crisis finally came to a head in 1927. We have this frantic telegram from Theodore Ward, Charles's father, begging Dr. Willett to intervene.
In the telegram, he says Charles had locked himself in the library for 2 full days, and he could hear him talking to someone inside, even though he knew for a fact Charles went in alone.
The presence of another voice in that locked room, that's the first physical evidence of a successful summoning.
Exactly. Which leads us to the final, critical transformation just before he's committed in early 1928. Despite years of physical decay, the wasting, the cough people, including Willett, reported a sudden, unsettling vigor in him.
His speech was now totally unfamiliar, archaic,
Yeah.
deeply commanding. He was talking about his great work nearing completion and referring over and over to the essential salts.
And this point is absolutely critical to understanding the possession. The wasting sickness wasn't Ward dying. It was the body being prepared for a new occupant. The vigor that was the 18th century Kerwin taking the wheel, forcing the body to perform.
So Willett's final diagnosis, the man who entered that hospital wasn't Charles Ward anymore.
No, it was Joseph Kerwin, wearing Charles Ward's skin. A full usurpation had occurred. The scholar was gone.
To verify that terrifying conclusion, we have to look at the physical crime scene, the laboratory at 100 Patuxent Road. This is where the paper trail becomes saturated with the smell of death and high-grade chemistry.
Absolutely. Detective Rourke's preliminary search memorandum. It gives us the gruesome material evidence for the necromancy. The property itself was chosen for total isolation. It was fortified like a bunker.
Rourke's notes highlight custom, high-grade locks that the Ward family's own keys didn't even fit, and heavy planking boarding up all the windows from the inside.
And the lab setup inside was far beyond anything an amateur would have. Rourke details an unfamiliar electrically powered furnace designed for extremely high temperatures, custom ventilation to handle toxic fumes, and these large 50-gallon vats made of lead and pewter.
And inside the vats,
A thick, dark, viscous residue. And the air in the whole place was permeated with this noxious odor, which Rourke described as acrid and chemical, but with an underlying scent that was disturbingly animalic or musky.
it's the byproduct of the work, isn't it? The calcination and reconstitution of human remains.
Precisely. And the logistics of the operation confirm its scale and its focus on high temperature reduction. The shipping manifest from 1926 details these highly specific, very unusual bulk purchases.
What kind of things are we talking about?
Well, you have things like 20 pounds of ground lapis lazuli, often used for its mineral purity, alongside 500 pounds of lead ingot, which suggests heavy shielding or containment of something volatile.
Okay.
And then large quantities of glacial acetic and nitric acids. These are potent chemicals historically used for dissolving or purifying organic materials, including bone.
And then there's the clear link to a conspiracy. A crate of unidentified salts from S. Orne, Salem, MA.
Right. This confirms Ward wasn't acting alone. He was sourcing material from a network of others who understood Kerwin's work and his need for these very specific substances.
And there was a living component, too. The manifest lists a really disturbing shipment. A live specimen, avian allergy, marked Handle W Extreme Care.
And the instructions for all these deliveries were bizarre.
Yep.
Late-night drop-offs only, after 2 a.m., and the driver was prohibited from approaching the occupant. And that occupant in the manifest, he isn't called Charles Ward, he's called Dr. Allen.
Dr. Allen. This is the crucial cooperator. Neighbors Rourke interviewed said they rarely, if ever, saw Charles Ward. Instead, the person they saw managing things was an older, tall, pale, clean-shaven man.
And Ward referred to this man as Dr. Allen. He was the one directing all the late-night logistics. Rourke completely missed the significance, of course. He just filed him as Ward's secretive partner.
But the real locus of the horror was below ground, in the cellar.
Yes. The trapdoor led to a dirt floor cellar where the odor was, quote, overpowering. The floor had been deliberately excavated to embed 3 large, sunken lead vats, and each one contained that thick, black, tar-like substance, the sludge from the process.
And this is where they were doing the chemical reduction. Rourke's search around the vats uncovered small, calcined bone fragments. This is where we definitively connect the lab to the process of reducing human bodies to ash.
And the neighbors. They corroborated that something profound and physical was happening down there. Mrs. Hannah Fell, who was interviewed in Document 10, she described hearing this low, resonant groaning at night.
But she stressed it wasn't just loud. She said it was felt in your feet. It shook the house enough to make the windows rattle.
Which suggests the agitation of something vast, something heavy, and perhaps imprisoned deep underground, connected to those vats.
But the final piece of physical evidence that baffled Rourke and totally illuminated things for Willett was the salts archive.
Right, a cabinet.
Yeah.
Inside, over 100 glass specimen jars, each filled with a fine powder, meticulously labeled with initials and dates. GP 1745, JF 1723. Rourke just logged them as unknown chemical compounds.
That sounds like willful ignorance for a detective investigating a disappearance linked to chemicals and bone fragments.
It was a failure of imagination, and it's one that Willett leveraged. In Document 4, which he wrote after he deliberately bypassed the police seals to investigate the site himself, he recognized immediately what that cabinet was.
It wasn't a chemical archive.
It was a necropolis. The salts were the essential salts, the calcined ashes of the dead.
So the alchemy here is crucial. The belief was that by reducing a body to its purest mineral form, the salt, you could capture the complete spiritual, psychological, and historical essence of that person.
And Kerwin's ambition was to conquer death by reconstitution, by binding that essence back to a physical form derived from its own dust. Willett confirmed this horrifying theory by deciphering Charles's research ledger, which had Kerwin's own coded texts.
There's an entry from Kerwin's journal, 1754, that details the process explicitly.
It does. It confirms he was resurrecting and interviewing the dead. The entry reads, "I have raised up N.P. 1706, who was stubborn, but did speak of the old matters under persuasion."
That's the clinical documentation of extracting knowledge from a dead person's reformed essence. And Kerwin then details needing physical fluid to maintain the shape. He writes, "The blood is the key, for they are but shadows and must be given body. The fluid from a man serves well."
And the final, chilling detail is Kerwin's reliance on a specific, non-human binding agent. He notes that the shades were ungrateful and prone to insolence, and that he required the formulae of Yog-Sothoth to bind them fast, for I fear what they might tell one another if I am not present.
So his entire practice relied on controlling these powerful, maybe cosmic entities just to keep his reconstituted dead in line.
The conclusion is just undeniable. Charles Ward had just found Kerwin's notes. He had successfully raised the essential salts of Joseph Kerwin himself. The man known as Dr. Allen was the reanimated 18th century sorcerer back in Providence, using Ward's body as a temporary home.
To really grasp the monstrous nature of what Kerwin restarted in the 1920s, we have to understand the full scope of the original horror back in 1771. We have to turn to Document 5, the archived report of the Committee of Vigilance.
This 18th century manuscript, it documents an act of what they saw as necessary violence. The good men of Providence concluded that the established law was powerless against Kerwin's crimes because they didn't have a name for them.
The townspeople's dread was palpable. It had been building for years. They noted shadows in his trade, his constant bulk purchases of strange instruments and chemicals, and that he only associated with the lowest elements of society.
And that dread turned to fury over the vanished men from the ships Destiny and Vigilant, who were seen going to his farm but were never seen again.
And just like in 1928, there were the incessant, hellish cries and shriekings at night, and stenches so foul they would drift on the wind and cause men to faint and cattle to miscarry.
The historical pattern is identical. Chemical crime, human disappearance, unnatural sound.
This all led to the formation of the Committee of Vigilance, made up of prominent local figures. On April 12, 1771, they decided to act as defenders of God's creation, knowing full well they risked everything.
Their raid, carried out by 100 armed men, found Kerwin's farm was a fortress. He'd been forewarned and was gone, but his lab in the main house was, as they put it, a blasphemy, stocked for a darker purpose with vats of monstrous size.
But the real terror was below ground. Behind the barn, they found a great stone trapdoor, secured with heavy iron, leading down into what they described as a vast man-made cavern.
This was the entrance to the great network of vaults, extending hundreds of feet into the earth, all illuminated by this eerie phosphor light.
And the scenes they described below were something from hell itself, great pits filled with some noisome substance, implements of torture and surgery, and huge glass jars preserving limbs and organs of a shape not found in any natural creature.
Which points clearly to Kerwin's horrific amalgamation experiments, combining the reconstituted essence of people with unnatural biological material.
And in the deepest chamber, they found the entities. The things Kerwin had raised or made, held in cells, constantly gibbering, they were described as partial, half-formed mockeries of a human shape.
These were the results of combining the essential salts with the required fluid from a man.
One of the most chilling moments they documented is when one of these things, even though its head was not a head, it spoke directly to a Mr. Hopkins in the voice of his cousin, who had drowned at sea 2 years prior.
It begged for release, which reveals that Kerwin was accessing the complete, agonizing, recognizable memory of the dead. Then it cursed them in a language that, quote, blistered the ears.
The psychological impact of that. Realizing Kerwin wasn't just pulling back shadows, but imprisoning the core identity of the dead in these grotesque forms. It must have been devastating. They were facing a horror that denied the sanctity of death itself.
And there were bigger, more terrifying things. The thing in a pit that was vast and pale and living, yet had no features. Perhaps the source of the earth-shaking groans. And the thing in an iron cage that shrieked with a multitude of voices.
The resolution was swift and brutal. It was driven by a desperate need for complete eradication. They used powder kegs and oil to burn the unholy things.
They burned the farmhouse, the laboratory, and, critically, used 3 massive kegs of powder to collapse and seal the vaults, burying those depths forever.
And they swore a binding oath of secrecy. They struck Kerwin's name from the town records and prayed the knowledge had died with him. They succeeded in erasing it from public history for 157 years.
Only for Charles Dexter Ward to accidentally find the key and raise the exact architect to the horror they tried so hard to bury. Which brings us back to 1928 and the climax. Dr. Willett's final desperate confrontation, all detailed in his sealed affidavit, Document 6.
And this document is the only source that explains the locked room vanishing.
Right. Willett, having now deciphered the Kerwin ciphers, was no longer operating under the delusion that Charles was merely sick. He confirms the person committed to Dr. Waits was Kerwin, reconstituted. The insanity was just the 18th century sorcerer struggling to master the modern world.
So the escape wasn't a physical act.
Not at all. Kerwin's notes revealed it was a teleportation, transcorporeal movements through the spheres. This was only achievable by dissolving the physical shell and reprecipitating in a known place of power.
Which was, of course, the Patuxent Laboratory, the site of the original catacombs.
It explains the chemical stench in the undisturbed bars perfectly. Kerwin didn't climb out. He dissolved and reformed.
But what happened to the real Charles Ward?
Kerwin's journal provided the brutal answer. Willett confirms the abominable rite of transference happened back in February. Kerwin seized control of the vessel, and Charles's own persona became a conscious prisoner inside his own hijacked body.
So Charles Dexter Ward, the man, was murdered and his body was stolen.
Correct. And the threat was far larger than just one man in Providence. Kerwin's coded letters revealed he was just the vanguard. He was part of a triumvirate of necromancers. Himself, a Simon O. in Salem, that's Oren, and a Jedediah H. in Prague.
They weren't just seeking knowledge. They were planning to supplant the living and build an army of reconstituted sorcerers by amassing these essential salts.
This realization is what spurred Willett to act. He broke the police seals, went back to Patuxent, knowing Kerwin was down there, working. He found the cellar trap door was now the newly cleared entrance to the original 1771 catacombs.
He describes going down with an electric torch into a vast, vaulted cavern, hundreds of feet deep, carved from the rock. This was Kerwin's real metaphysical lab.
The floor was covered in this vast, carved geometric sigil, and on a raised altar, Willett found one of the folios open to a specific incantation, a formula for binding and, critically, for dismissal.
And in a side chamber, he made the most horrifying discovery of all. He found a lead cabinet containing 2 final crucial jars of salts. The first was labeled Joseph C. 1771. That was Kerwin's backup, his own dust.
But the second jar, sealed and labeled, read, Charles D.W., 1928.
Oh, wow.
Willett realized the absolute horror of it. Kerwin had forced Charles Ward to prepare his own essential salts, to calcine his own remains, ensuring that when Kerwin was finished with the body, Charles Ward would be utterly and permanently annihilated, reduced to a labeled jar of dust, ready to be thrown away.
He was murdered by his own hand, controlled by his ancestor.
That knowledge gave Willett his weapon. The dismissal formula he snatched from the altar. Document 12, a blood-stained, torn note they found later. It shows his desperate preparation.
He armed himself with the specific counterspell from Kerwin's own texts. The binding name was Yog Sothoth, and the dismissal counterspell, scrawl encircled, was Oji Sothoth Nga Nya.
And the translation, written right next to it, shows the focus of the attack. By his name I dissolve thee. By his name I send thee back to the Solstice. He was going to reverse the process, force the sorcerer back into inert ash.
And Willett knew the stakes. The final line of his affidavit confirms he was going back into the tunnels that night to confront the entity, armed only with knowledge, facing the full horror of the 1771 creations, including that nameless, featureless thing in the pit.
He traded his sanity and maybe his life for the safety of the world. And the final result of that confrontation is detailed in the Providence Police Final Case Summary, Document 7, which brings our whole narrative to a horrifying but conclusive end in May 1928.
The first discovery was Dr. Willett himself. At 5:30 a.m. on April 21st, he was found wandering on Patuxent Road, suffering from acute amnesia and profound psychic shock.
For 3 days, his only utterances were fragmented phrases. The salts sent him back, the pit, and just the repeated, shouted word, Yog-Sothoth.
He was committed to Dr. Waite's, the very same institution, and his prognosis was poor. The police, launching a final search of the catacombs on April 22nd, found physical evidence that, even though they dismissed his affidavit as fantasy, confirmed he had succeeded.
In that central vaulted chamber where Willett had found the altar, officers found human remains a pile of fine bluish-gray dust, about 5 or 6 pounds worth, scattered as if by a sudden blast.
And right alongside this dust was a modern black leather shoe, which was positively identified as belonging to Dr. Allen.
Willett had done it. He had successfully dissolved the reanimated Joseph Kerwin back into his constituent salts.
And Human Remains B confirmed Charles Ward's final tragic fate. In the side chamber, the lead cabinet held that sealed jar of brownish-gray powder labeled Charles D.W. 1928.
State chemists confirmed both sets of remains were essential salts, the calcined ash of 2 separate adult males. Charles Dexter Ward was officially declared deceased.
The final dreadful confirmation came from Attachment 7A, an unread letter, addressed to Willett from Curran, postmarked the day before the confrontation.
And in that letter, Kerwin confirms everything. I am Joseph Kerwin. The boy called me up, and I, being the stronger, took his vessel. He is no more. He boasts about the powers he serves, those beyond the spheres, and he confirms his conspirators. Orrin and Hutchinson shall rise again.
But the letter also contained the final explanation for Willett's shattered mind. Kerwin threatens him. He says, I have commanded that in the pit to seek you out should you return to the farm. It is a thing from outside, bound to my will, and it is hungry.
So Willett didn't just face the sorcerer. He faced the nameless, featureless entity bound in the cavern below. That's what led to his profound psychotic break.
The internal police conclusion was that the case was closed by death and insanity, though it completely defied rational explanation. The disposition order, urged by the Ward family, mandated immediate and total action.
The Patuxent bungalow was to be razed to the ground, and the catacombs and cellar were to be permanently filled and sealed with a final overwhelming burial, 20 tons of quicklime and concrete.
An extreme act of containment designed to permanently entomb that gateway to cosmic horror.
And finally, there was the public deception. The official narrative was meticulously crafted. Charles Ward, in a fit of mania, murdered his unknown accomplice, Allen, then took his own life via chemical incineration. Dr. Willett suffered a nervous collapse when he found them.
And no mention of the occult, the catacombs, or the 1771 raid was ever to be made public. The terrifying knowledge was contained, sealed, and buried under tons of cement and institutional silence.
The full circle of this narrative is just terrifyingly complete. A 157-year-old horror, twice suppressed by men acting outside the law, and all that's left is dust, institutionalized madness, and a carefully constructed lie.
It really speaks to the absolute necessity of that cover-up, doesn't it? The authorities understood, even if they couldn't admit the occult nature of it, that the continued existence of this forbidden knowledge, the location of the salts, the formula for reconstitution, it posed an existential risk.
And the complete obliteration of the Patuxent site ensures that the knowledge Kerwin sought and the names of those he intended to resurrect, Orrin and Hutchinson, remain sealed underground.
The cost of Charles Dexter Ward's pursuit of forbidden knowledge wasn't just his life or his sanity. It was the absolute physical obliteration of his identity. He was reduced to an item in a labeled archive before his body was even fully seized.
Which leaves us with the ultimate chilling thought. Joseph Kerwin was meticulous enough to prepare Charles Ward's salts before he'd even fully taken over his body. So given the global scale of the conspiracy he hinted at, the fact that S. Orrin and J.H. are named conspirators waiting to rise again, we have to ask, what level of preparation exists for those other necromancers? Their essential souls are still out there, carefully collected, anchored in the world, waiting for the right conjunction. Or maybe just for the day the 20 tons of quicklime and cement finally crack.